What we're working on today is a fan hub and fan assembly for the 1925 Model T Coupe. I noticed wiggling around under there, the fan and hub had some play in it like this. And I was concerned about keeping the flat fan belt centered on the pulleys as well as the crank pulley. The crank pulley doesn't have any flanges on it, so I didn't want the belt to rub against the flange on this hub or possibly jump off the crankshaft pulley. So what I found was there's oil-light bushings in this hub. There's two of them, one on each side pressed in there, as well as of course this is the shaft that goes in there for the hub to rotate on. What I found was the shaft is quite worn, so it doesn't make sense to replace the bushings without replacing the shaft. These are available and they're not horribly expensive, so most folks would just buy them. I got plenty of time right now, so I decided to make a new shaft. It wasn't too difficult. The shaft is drilled. You can see a hole there. The shaft is drilled so grease can go through there to flow around and lubricate the bearings. Normally oil-light bearings, it's a bearing material, you use oil to lubricate them. But I suppose grease will be better than nothing. So there's the new shaft. New oil-light bushings pushed in here, pressed in here. This old oil-light bearing went on like that. As you can see how much play that had in it, quite a bit. And that was allowing everything to wobble around in there. And that fits in there about like that, so you can see the oil or grease can flow through here around this shaft and keep everything lubricated. The other bearing would fit on like this, so there's a gap there. And you can see where it's not worn here. That's the dimension I used to make the new one. It's 5/8 of an inch. There's some little flats machined on here to hold it with a wrench or something, as well as flats on this end, and I duplicated those on the new one. So that turned out pretty well. I just had some blank oil-light material, just a solid bar of it, because none of these dimensions seem to be standard. This was 5/8. I don't recall what this outside dimension was here, but about everything's got to be custom made or buy it from a Model T supplier, and they had some machine shop make them, I'm sure. Well, we've got that fixed. There's a gasket that goes on here, so when you put the grease in here and the fan blades bolt on here like that, there's a gasket there to keep the grease from slinging all over. There'll probably be some leak out, but if it slings out, that'll keep the underside of the hood from rusting. There's a little cup washer that goes on here, and it also had some sort of a packing material or something. It was all dried out and hard, and it looked like it might have been felt at one time, so that's what I used. Henry used a lot of felt gaskets and things like that, so I think this probably will work okay. That fits on here to try to keep the grease contained in the bearing where it belongs. There's a lot of oddities on this. They may not have been odd for Model Ts, but this is a 7/16 20 threads per inch thread. You don't see that on a lot of machinery. This assembly goes together something like this. Of course, the fan's on here. This is the arm that holds everything together. on the engine. Then there's a bolt that goes through here to fasten it to the engine, and your fan would go here. So that project was kind of fun to do, and I believe it turned out good. One other project I was working on, the rear hubs on the rear axle are tapered, as well as, of course, the axle is tapered too. And those tapers go together to hold the hub on the axle, and there's also a key, square key in the axle. The only way to get them off without damaging anything is to have a puller, something like this. And you can buy a puller, somebody's made them or something. I had some stock around, got to fooling around with it and looking at it, and I said, well, I think I can make one of those. So what I did is took the hub off the rear axle, used it for a test pattern. This is a piece of aluminum tubing, and I turned the same hub thread dimensions on this piece of aluminum tubing, using the hub as a test device so I could test the depth and cut of my thread and so on, so it would fit. I got that done, everything fit the hub perfectly. Then I started the internal threads on this part. Internal threads have always been kind of hard for me, especially something that fine. But I think they turned out well. I kept turning down and cutting 2 or 3 thousandths at a time, so I didn't have a bad thread, and kept using this piece of tubing to test my threads. And you can see a fine thread like that's pretty easy to get cross threaded. I get it just right here, go in there perfectly. But you got to be careful. Something like that. Once you get everything lined up correctly, it goes in perfectly. It's a good fit. Should work perfectly for that. I left a hole in here so I could put a bar or a screwdriver or something in there, so I could use that to turn this onto the hub. And that's a 7/8 bolt in there I'm going to use to push against the end of the axle and pull that hub assembly off. Probably can't see inside there, but I put a little taper on the end of this, and there's also a little hole in the end of the axle. This should fit in there and pull that hub off without damaging anything. I want to pull those hubs off to inspect the emergency brakes and clean everything up in there and make sure that's all working correctly. So that's my projects for this afternoon.